Welcome to Sino-Warfare with Ralph D. Sawyer.
A passage in an eclectic Han Dynasty text asserts that an official called a mu, a term that basically means shepherd, should be established for the tribute and the steppe regions and charged with intelligence gathering. Now, although the peripheral sedentary Chinese states and the contiguous nomadic people spied upon each other from the earliest days, the shepherd's existence is historically unattested. Nevertheless, since the conception stimulated discussion in later eras and thus gained a sort of secondary historicity, it's worth noting. Somewhat abridged, it states, the king must establish 2 shepherds for each of the 4 quarters, and depute them to secretly observe the distant regions and oversee their masses. When any of the people in distant quarters suffer from hunger or cold without being given clothing and food, or there are criminal cases and lawsuits in which the charges were not equitably decided, or the worthy fail to be appointed to office, they should send reports back to the Son of Heaven. Now, with this information in hand, the king can upbraid the local leaders and thereby overwhelm them with his awesome perspicacity. Concern with the ever-evolving steppe peoples and the threats they pose would inexorably continue across the centuries. Sedentary China suffered unremitting invasions and occasional conquests that ranged from partial in the Wei-Jin period and the Tang and Sung to total when the Mongols and later the Jurchen established conquest dynasties. Chapters in the Shiji, the great synthetic history compiled about 100 BC from various historical materials and, more importantly, court records on the Xiongnu, the Taiyuan, and other peripheral groups, show a resolute quest to acquire detailed knowledge of these peoples and their states, as well as the extensiveness of Chinese knowledge of the steppe. Zhang Qian's famous 18-year Han diplomatic mission out into the steppe toward the end of the 2nd century BC to establish relations with a group known as the Yuezhi in the hope that they could be persuaded to attack the intervening Xiongnu, epitomizes the deliberate exploitation of this information. The knowledge he acquired, carefully recorded and stored on bamboo rolls, proved invaluable as the former Han strove to master the threat posed by the nomadic peoples, especially the Xiongnu, who they eventually managed to split into rival camps and to tranquilize with external marriage relations, temporarily lessening the danger. Thereafter, missions that often required years to complete were annually undertaken, purportedly for diplomatic reasons, but always with the collateral purpose of gaining information. Officials and commanders throughout the imperial period, as well as in earlier times, also employed traders and merchants to actively spy on nearby groups, bandit gangs, which were always numerous, and peasant movements. Now, rather than an anomaly, the resulting imperial records continued a dedicated practice that began in the spring and autumn period, when the remaining states began to aggressively encroach upon each other, as we've discussed in other talks. In the face of armed conflict, political and military information became highly valued. The major states apparently kept dossiers on each other, as well as summaries of developments that were compiled from external reports, often formally dispatched to them, and also the reporting of their own diplomatic personnel, all of which were kind of integrated with ongoing internal events. Only 2 survive: the Spring and Autumn Annals, maintained by the state of Lu, and the Bamboo Annals, by the state of Wei. Both are studies in brevity, though because the Spring and Autumn Annals was supposedly edited by Confucius, the wording is believed to obliquely express his judgment on events. Now, while somewhat handicapped by being partial and reflecting the state's perspective, they depict a world plagued by strife and provide important knowledge about both interstate relations and significant internal developments. They're therefore evidence of the felt need for information about potential enemies, not to mention friends and allies. In response to admonitions first articulated in The Art of War, traditional Chinese military science has always emphasized the need to base military planning upon accurate information. right up to the late Qing Dynasty monograph Jinshu, or Book of Spies. The nature of intelligence objectives and the means to realize them were therefore actively pondered, generally in discrete chapters preserved in military writings such as the Hu Qianjing and the Tobi Futan, as well as Shizimei's lengthy disquisition on Sunzi's employing spies, which in itself is China's third focal contemplation. Vital practices and insightful comments are also found in the lengthy biographies of experienced commanders preserved in China's famous 25 histories, and in earlier works that encompass another 500 years of conflict. In aggregate, they depict an extensive, highly conscious effort to realize Sunzi's ideal of know the enemy and yourself, even though the targets, of course, continue to evolve and the methods changed over the years. Now, just to review, because of warfare's overwhelming impact, the art of war stressed the need to acquire concrete knowledge of the enemy before attempting to formulate strategy or decide tactics. Quote, the means by which enlightened rulers and sagacious generals moved and conquered others, that their achievements surpassed the masses, was advanced knowledge. Ignorance, of course, has dire effects, including being unable to form alliances, maneuver the army, or exploit the terrain. Furthermore, in order to ensure its reliability, Sunzi rejected results of divination and prognostication. And in this he was followed by several important writers, particularly Wei Liaozi, who we'll hear about later, though their efforts failed to prevent prognosticatory practices from flourishing and actually affecting events. Thereafter, the constantly escalating scope, frequency, and lethality of warring states' conflict made the study of warfare essential. Not surprisingly, the era's political and military thinkers therefore prioritized intelligence gathering. Thus, the Sima Fa advised employing spies against the distant and observing the near. The other warring states' classic military manuals mentioned dispatching spies to learn the enemy's plans. And Sun Bin concisely said, one who analyzes the enemy and estimates the terrain will be victorious. However, the most explicit assertions appear in two works of political philosophy, the Guanzi and the Huainanzi, an eclectic work traditionally attributed to the great spring and autumn political advisor known as Guanzhong, but probably composed during the mid to late Warring States period. The Guanzi emphasizes foreknowledge. Quote, initiating military activities without undertaking estimations and assessments is like wanting to cross a dangerous river without boats or oars. The analysis concludes by echoing Sunzi's earlier pronouncement. Anyone who doesn't know the enemy's government cannot make plans against them. Anyone who doesn't know the enemy's true situation cannot constrain them with agreements. Anyone who doesn't know the enemy's generals cannot mobilize the army. And anyone who doesn't know the enemy's officers cannot deploy the army against them. Now, a military chapter in the Huainanzi, which is an eclectic Han Dynasty work that integrates late warring states' thought on many issues, defines tactical wisdom in terms of clandestine intelligence gathering and maneuvering the army. Quote, someone who excels in employing secret agents, and here the term is jiandie, investigating actions, fathoming thoughts, establishing the obscure, setting ambushes, concealing the army's shape, and going forth where unexpected so that the enemy's troops can never succeed in their defensive preparations, is said to understand the tactical balance of power. Chuan. Now, assertion of this need, often consciously based on the art of war, continues throughout Chinese history. For example, in the Three Kingdoms period, the famous strategist Zhuge Liang said, those who excel at combat invariably first investigate the enemy's situation and thereafter make their plans. And Li Jing, undoubtedly the most successful military commander and innovative military thinker in the Tang Dynasty, similarly stressed the importance of acquiring knowledge. Quote, the measures for achieving decisive victory lie in investigating the opposing general's talent and abilities, analyzing the enemy's strengths and weaknesses, determining the configuration and strategic advantages of terrain, observing the advantages of the appropriate moment, and first being victorious, only thereafter engaging in combat and defending positions without losing them. And he buttressed his argument by pointing out the dire effects of misperception. There are situations which appear similar, but their strategic power differs. And those with identical strategic power, but different appearances. By according with the situation, you can be completely successful with one movement. But if you strike when the situation is not conducive, your movements will certainly be defeated. The 13th century 100 unorthodox strategies, shown here in my translation, reasserted the need for spies to acquire the necessary information. Whenever planning to conduct a major military expedition, you should first employ spies to determine the enemy's troop strength, their emptiness or fullness, and movement and rest, and only thereafter mobilize the army. And in the Ming, in a statement reminiscent of Suzi, after assuming the mantle of authority over the three armies and assuming control of their fate, any general who confronts fierce enemies or pursues them into the wilds only to engage in a standoff, but doesn't know the enemy's situation, is a blockhead. When two forces struggle to master each other, anyone who doesn't employ spycraft is a wild animal. Now the key question then becomes, what information is necessary? And then, how can it be acquired? The Art of War essentially answered both of them by stressing the need for human agents, enumerating several critical factors in its first chapter, and emphasizing knowledge of the terrain, as we previously discussed. Although the later military writers would add a few others and vary the originals, they essentially concurred in focusing upon the ruler and government, command capability, force strength, geostrategic advantages, military organization and discipline, training, economic prosperity, character of the people, the climate, which actually proved surprisingly important as armies found themselves compelled to fight in unfamiliar, often hostile conditions. Pre-battle, the emphasis falls upon strength, position, and the state of the enemy's army, including their physical condition and their combat morale, and the commanding general's character and capability. Information acquired from prisoners and defectors, while always suspect, may prove useful if corroborated, but active acquisition measures should never be neglected.
As always, thank you for watching.